Hi there! In this video, I'm going to be reviewing your macro and close-up photos. And thank you to the many people who sent photos in for this video. I've chosen 5 photographers to go with, so without any delay, let's get into the first one. This photo of a Hylas spider was sent in by Rahul Kumar from India. And Rahul is a part-time wedding photographer, but he's getting into macro. He took this photo on his Canon EOS 77D with reversal rings, which is a great way to get into macro photography. And you can check out more of Rahul's work on Instagram. Now, Rahul also edited this photo in Snapseed, so didn't use one of the traditional desktop photo editing packages. It was a JPEG edited through his phone. And I thought you might find that rather interesting because editing JPEGs is often rather frowned upon, and I absolutely admit you can get a lot more from a RAW file, but you can also do a decent amount of editing with JPEGs. So sometimes if you need to do something quick and on the move, it's not always a bad thing unless you need to edit something heavily. But moving on from that, let's get into what I really like about this photo. So the eyes here are absolutely awesome. And if you do check out Rahul's Instagram, you'll see a picture of a horsefly there that also has amazing eyes. But what I like about the eyes of this spider are the reflections that you can see. So look here, we've got the trees and background reflected in those eyes, and that is superb. Now, another reason that I chose this particular photo of a spider was because I had many photos of spiders and almost all of them had quite dark black eyes. But just want to mention something. There were a few that were taken indoors, and some of those people mentioned that they were taken indoors. There were a couple of people who tried to claim they'd taken those photos outside, and I could see your furniture in the background reflected in those eyes. So I didn't choose your photo, and it's just a note of caution. If you submit those kind of photos to competitions or anything like that, that's the kind of thing that's likely to get you disqualified. Even if it might not technically be against the rules, the judges might decide that you've lied to them, and that's enough to knock you out. So just a word of caution, don't try to claim something that you didn't do to try and impress somebody else. Now, it's not a bad thing taking photos of spiders indoors at all. For many spiders, the house is their environment. I get spiders in my house all the time. So I don't think there's a problem with taking photos of spiders in the house. Just don't try to claim that they're outdoors. But Rahul's photo is superb because it shows the outdoors in those eyes. Absolutely tremendous. Now, you can see here that it was probably taken with a quite wide aperture. I'm thinking maybe f4 or even wider. And the reason I don't know is because Rahul used that reversing ring, so you don't get EXIF data written back to the camera to tell you the aperture settings. And unless your lens that you're using has a manual aperture ring, the only way to set it is to attach it the right way round to your camera, set the aperture, and then reverse it again. So you were probably using a wide aperture and just stuck with it. But I think had you used something slightly narrower and gone for maybe f9, f10, something like that, you'd have got a lot more of that spider's body in focus, which would have brought the hairs to life at the front of the spider as well as those eyes. So it's great that you focused on the eyes, but you could potentially have got more of those hairs nice and sharp and in focus. There's another thing I want to mention though on the composition. So the background is quite contrasty between the edge of that petal that the spider appears to be on and the darker background. And you could have done a little to change the background by lifting your position slightly. It wouldn't have needed very much. Just to lift your camera ever so slightly and tilt it down ever so slightly towards the spider, and you'd have got more of the petal in the background and less of the dark background. Also look out for the spider's limbs. So you've taken this in portrait orientation, and I really like the fact that you've set the spider off to one side, it's slightly looking up, and you've given it some negative space to look into, which is great. But because you've cut off some of the spider's limbs, it does look a little bit odd. So it's great to get all the limbs in the photo if you can. And it might have been easier for you to do that had you taken the photo in landscape orientation. So thanks very much, Rahul. Great work. So one of the photos that really stood out to me was this one of a cucumber beetle by Grace Halliday, and I really like it. We'll get into why in a moment. You can find more of Grace's work on Instagram. Grace is mainly a wildlife photographer, and she's recently started dabbling in macro photography as well. And Grace has a fantastic photo of a red-winged blackbird silhouetted against the moon. Fantastic. Go and have a look at that. But this photo really stood out to me for a number of reasons. So firstly, I love the colours and I love the overall aesthetic of it as it drifts in and out of focus throughout the scene. And part of that is because Grace took this photo with a vintage macro lens, which is a fantastic way to go. There's a lot to be said for taking photos with vintage lenses. Now, I know a lot of people don't like that because it means that you don't get a lot of the electrical connections. You often have to find adapters to be able to use them with modern cameras. But it is a really interesting thing to do and worthwhile experimenting with. And if you don't really want to try out vintage lenses, you can get modern lenses that replicate some vintage styles. So, for example, I know that Lens Baby makes a few lenses that are in that kind of style, but are modern and work with modern cameras, particularly things like their Velvet range. So, again, something that's worth having a look at. But coming back to Grace's photo, another thing I love about this photo is that you almost don't notice the subject at first glance. And I think this really shows how insects can blend in with their environment. So let's think about some things that you could change. And one of them is to do with the fact that the subject is quite small in the frame. And I think many people, myself included, would be tempted to crop in. But I don't think you should do that because I just love the overall effect of the picture. However, macro photographers do have a tendency to want to get smaller and smaller and smaller subjects. And to do that with a true macro lens that gets you 1:1 magnification is really difficult. If your subject is less than a centimetre across, as this cucumber beetle is, then it's not going to fill very much of the frame at all on a 35mm full frame sensor. So when you're looking at really small subjects, you might want to start to think about using an ultra macro lens that might get you 2 or more times magnification. And Lauer is a great manufacturer of ultra macro lenses to go and look at. However, with that, you would lose that vintage look because there aren't ultra macro lenses that were available back in the day. And I think part of the beauty of this photo is that vintage look. So it's a trade-off there really for you, a choice whether you want to get closer to your subject or whether you want the look that you achieved. But there is one other way to do it, and that is to use extension tubes. So you can put some extension tubes on your existing 1:1 magnification macro lens, and it will allow you to focus even closer, which then means you can achieve greater than 1:1 magnification. So things that you probably should change. Well, there's a little dark area of the background just over here, and it's quite off-putting. We know, I've spoken about this quite a few times, that eyes get drawn to highlights and contrasts. And over up in that corner, you've got some highlights with those bokeh balls that are showing up. And then immediately below it, you've got a dark area. So you've got both highlights and contrast there that are drawing your eye away from the subject. Now, I think you probably could have done something with this if you'd gone at it from a slightly different angle. If, for example, you photographed that cucumber beetle slightly side on instead of immediately from above, you'd have probably got more of those bokeh balls in the background from surrounding flowers. But I don't know, I wasn't there. It's just something to be thinking about, changing your composition to remove those background contrasts if you can. But great job, Grace. I do really love this photo, and keep it up, and I hope you keep using that vintage lens. Next up, we've got this lovely photo of a poison dart frog by Mark Noll. And Mark is a little bit more experienced than our previous two photographers in this video, but I really love this photo. It's one of my favourites out of all of those that were submitted. And you might be wondering how a frog classes as macro photography, and I think that very much depends whereabouts you are in the world and the type of frogs that you're used to seeing. But these colourful poison dart frogs are tiny. They're about the size of your thumbnail. So this is a true macro photo. Now you can check out more of Mark's work on Instagram, and he's got some fantastic photos of hummingbirds on there, so go check that out. So firstly, what do I like about this photo? Well, I do love the layering, so you get that layering as you drift from foreground blur into the subject in focus and then the defocused background, and that gives you a little bit more depth to your photo. I also love the composition, so you've done exactly the right thing, offsetting your subject to one side, but more importantly than just offsetting your subject to one side, you've left negative space in the direction that the frog is looking. So it's looking along that tree stump or branch or whatever it is that it's sat upon, looking upwards, and it appears to be staring at something in the distance that we don't quite know what. And that gives a little bit of intrigue. So great composition from both the layering and the positioning of your subject. So what could be changed about this photo? Well, you'll see that the frog has got a black eye and it's got some black patches over its body, and some of those appear to be pure black. There doesn't appear to be any texture in it. So at first glance, it might look like you've got some crushed shadows, but you haven't. That histogram is entirely within the range, and so it's recoverable. And watch here as I increase the exposure slightly in Lightroom. You start to see that texture coming through in those black spots. You start to see the reflection in the frog's eyes, which is fantastic. So maybe just a little bit more in the editing would really help, but even thinking about these things in the field can help. So let's have a think about what's caused this. I think probably the most likely thing is because the frog has got some bright white patches on it, and that's from the light reflecting from the moisture that's on the frog. And I often suffer with the same issue when I'm taking photos of slugs and snails. I do like taking photos of slugs and snails. I don't know why more people don't do it. They're such an interesting subject, but they also carry a lot of moisture and reflect the light, and you get those bright white spots on them. So a couple of things to think about. Firstly, you want to be aware that those bright white spots are going to happen, because that's going to make the light meter in your camera think that the exposure is too high, and it's going to encourage you, therefore, to darken things down when you probably don't need to. So I always say you pay attention to the light meter, you pay attention to the histogram and make sure it's not going over the edge to the right and that the highlights are blown out, or over the edge to the left and the shadows are crushed. But you also want to use your eyes, and the combination of those three things should give you a pleasing exposure. The other thing you can do, and the thing that I should do myself more when I'm taking my slugs and snail photos, is to take out a circular polarizing filter, because I can use that to reduce that reflection, and it will reduce the effect of those bright white spots on it. Now, unfortunately, I often forget to take my CPL filter when I'm doing macro photography, and I must pack it more. But a good recommendation for you, get a CPL filter, take it with you in those types of situations. It will reduce the effect of those bright whites and probably won't therefore confuse your light meter into telling you you need to move the exposure down. So great work, Mark. I love this photo, and thanks very much for sending it in. So next up, we've got this photo of a leaf hopper from Damian, and you can check out more of Damian's work on Flickr. Now, Damian is a really new macro photographer, which is part of the reason that I chose this photo. And I believe, if I remember rightly, Damian only got the macro lens in February, so that shows just how new he is. But this macro lens is one of those ones I was talking about earlier. It's a Laowa 85mm, and it allows you to go to 2 times magnification. So getting closer to smaller subjects is possible with these lenses. Now, the reason I chose it was because Damian was so new, and there are always brand new macro photographers out there looking for support. It's a great thing to get into, and at this time of year in the Northern Hemisphere in spring, this is the time when people are starting about thinking of taking up macro photography because we're starting to get more insects around. So let's take a look at Damian's photo. So firstly, well done Damian for getting to grips with manual focusing so quickly, because this Laowa 85mm lens is entirely manual focus, so you have no choice but to manual focus with it. And I think you've got exactly the right idea by getting level with your subject and trying to take a side-on photo. That is usually where you get the best kind of images. You've also left some space in front of the subject, which is good, but your subject is placed pretty much at the centre of the photo, which means that the negative space behind the leaf hopper is a little bit wasted. So it might be better if you move your subject over to offset it to one side slightly, leaving even more space in front of it. And just thinking about that manual focus again, if we take a look at the area of the photo that's in focus, it's just going out of focus as you reach the eye. Then the body of the leaf hopper is in focus, and some of that leaf that's underneath it is in focus. So you need to move your focus to be on the eye. That's the key thing. That's what you want in focus. You weren't a million miles off it, but if you'd had it, you'd got a lot more detail in the eye, and it would help you connect with that subject a little bit more. Now, one thing to think about is the angle that the subject is facing you is ever so slightly turning away. So I'd be side on to you now. The photo is kind of the equivalent of here, slightly facing away, and in that position, it's hard to focus on the eyes. So you want the subject either looking towards you or slightly towards you, but not looking away from you because you're making things more difficult for yourself. But usually you do want the subject facing roughly towards the camera. It's not a rule, but it's just a good practice thing to do. So how can you improve your manual focusing technique? Well, there are 2 key things really. One is to turn on focus peaking. So focus peaking overlays your photo with some colours that show which parts of the scene are in focus. So that will give you a huge clue if you're not already using focus peaking. So the other thing that you can do is the rocking technique. Now, I've demonstrated that in a video before, and I'll link to that above and in the description below. So if you want a bit more detail on that technique, go and check it out. But generally how it works is you set your camera to 1:1 magnification, move till you're in a position where you're close to the focus that you want, i.e. on the eyes, and then just gently rock backwards and forwards and see how the focusing changes and see precisely the position you need to be in to get the eye in focus, and then snap the picture. Now, it's easier said than done. It does take a little bit of practice, but it's probably the technique that most people use. But well done, Damian, and thanks very much for sending a photo in so new in your macro photography journey. Well done. So next up, we've got a photo of a dragonfly by Eric Brown, and you can see more of Eric's work on Vero, and I really like your photo of the moonset happening over the Alaskan mountains. Go and check that out. So let's start with what's good about this photo. So the first thing is that the dragonfly is in focus throughout its entire body, which is really good. You must have been pretty much perfectly side on to the dragonfly in that situation. And there's loads of lovely detail in its body and even in the wings. Though the wings are spread out and so they drift in and out of focus, you can still pick out some really lovely details in there. So what could you change about this photo? Well, the first thing is that you have cropped quite a lot, so you weren't particularly close to the subject. And don't be afraid to get a little bit closer if it means that you can get a better picture. I know that that sometimes does mean that you scare the subject away, and we don't want to do that. But I think you were probably a little bit too far away in this situation. And with the crop that you've done, you've got the perch that the dragonfly is on coming out of the bottom of the picture. I would have cropped it slightly differently, and if you crop it so that that perch is coming out of the bottom left-hand corner, it looks slightly better. Diagonals always work better in compositions when they're coming from a corner or going to a corner. So that's something to be thinking about. It would also mean that your dragonfly's body would be offset to the left of the picture. Here it's ever so slightly offset to the right, which means there's less space in front of it than there is behind. And in terms of aesthetics, that's generally not quite so pleasing. So if you go with a slightly different crop, it will improve both the position of the subject and that diagonal line. So I also want to touch on the noise, because in the background we've got some contrasty areas. I'll come to the contrasts in a moment, but noise always shows up more in darker areas. And so those two dark patches we can see in the background, there's more apparent noise in them. And I can tell from your file that you've done some chrominance or colour noise reduction in Lightroom, but it doesn't appear that you've done any luminance noise reduction. And in those dark patches, there's that telltale salt and pepper noise that you can see. Now, I recognise that noise reduction in Lightroom isn't the easiest thing, although Lightroom has just introduced some new functionality for noise that appears to be better. But if you are still working with the noise sliders in Lightroom, go and check out a section of this video that I did on noise previously, and I cover how all of the Lightroom sliders work so that you can use them to your advantage, and you can eliminate both the chrominance or colour noise and the luminance or salt and pepper noise. And then finally, it's just to touch on those contrasty areas in the background. They are quite dark, and as I spoke about earlier in the video, eyes get drawn to contrasts. So those dark patches are pulling your eye away from your subject, and you want the attention on that beautiful dragonfly. So repositioning yourself slightly would help. And maybe that's about moving up or down or to one side or the other side. But one way or another, there would be a way to move things around so that you can try and position those dark, contrasty things in the background, whatever they were, outside of the scene. So thank you very much, Eric, for sending in your dragonfly. So thank you again to everyone who sent in photos for this photo review video. And the next photo review video will come in about 3 months' time. So keep your eyes out on the YouTube community tab, where I'll be posting another vote for you to choose the topic of the next video. But if this one has whetted your appetite for more photo reviews, you can check out my photo review playlist here. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.